foretold. The Mexican state, liberal, republican, and federal, of equality before the law is one that has always had to be a state of justice. When at the beginning of the 20th century, the state forgot this. The people rising in their revolution reminded it. President Carlos Salinas addressed to the nations early in 1989. We rose up, not to kill or to be killed, but so that they would listen to us. Subcomandante Marcos, San Cristobal, February 1994. In Mexico, the past reappears because it is a hidden present. Octavio Paz, Critique of the Pyramid. In 1992, every man, woman, and child who was still awake at the end of the assembly, according to Marcos, voted to instruct the Zapatista army to prepare for war. Once again, as in 1911, the indigenous rising was participated by the impact of an economic reform and modernization program imposed from above and driven by the perceived exigencies. I don't know this word, everybody. Let me go look up this word real quick. Can't say it. Exigency. Sorry, I couldn't say exigencies of a foreign model of development. No one disputes the credit due to President Carlos Salinas for rescuing Mexico from the financial ruin brought on by the debt crisis of 1982. Yet, while his economic reform policies attracted billions of dollars of foreign investment, much of it speculative investment in the booming Mexican stock exchange, controlled the national debt, stabilized the peso, and brought down triple-digit inflation of 7%. To 7%. These policies also produced an unprecedented concentration of wealth in the hands of a minuscule corporate and industrial elite. In 1990, a little over 2% of Mexican population controlled 78.5% of the nation's wealth. In Salinas, Mexico, once again, the historic division based on wealth and land ownership, exacerbated by the racial fault line between the non-indigenous landowners and the indigenous peasants, intensifying exponentially. Judging from the government reaction, the small ski mask figures who appeared on the streets of San Cristobal de la Casa on New Year's night might have been aliens dropping in on the NAFTA celebration from some other planet. Yet none of the self-evident causes of the rebellion, the misery, the hunger, the repression, the utter neglect and abandonment of the Mayan communities in Chiapas was news to anyone. Interviewing just days after the insurrection, the Japienquio playwright Carlos Almas told Proceso magazine, quote, "It has been an open secret that there are guerrillas in Chiapas. Peace in Chiapas has been a sham for centuries. Yet the Mexican army, members of President Salinas' cabinet, and the president himself also knew that there were guerrillas in Chiapas." In March 1993, on the official visit of Ogasago, President Salinas was positioned in person by leaders of the local Cattlemen's Association, who pleaded with him for government intervention to deal with the guerrillas training in the mountains just beyond the town. 2 months later, just 7 months before the Zapatistas seized San Cristobal and 3 other towns in the region, the Mexican army accidentally stumbled on the Zapatistas training camp. According to news reports, at the time, troops from out of the state sealed all the access roads into the rainforest, ransacked villages, and arrested and tormented non-Zapatista peasants. Yet when the army withdrew to barracks 3 weeks later, the military commander of the region publicly stated that, quote, there are no guerrillas in Chiapas. To drive home the point, the state attorney general added that anyone who saw fit to challenge this assertion would be seeking to damage Mexico's image. After the revolt, it was widely reported in Mexico and abroad that the government failed a counterinsurgents campaign during the U.S. Congress debates on NAFTA. This understandable reluctance to scuttle the image of Mexico in the United States on eve of major economic legislation affected both countries does not, however, explain the government's failure to address the festering misery and mounting frustrations in Chiapas. As long as the macroeconomic indicators remained healthy, it appears that the president of his team of young Harvard and Yale-educated economists were too busy stoking the transformation of the Mexican economy to access the social effects of their policies on the people who had to pay the price for the tight fiscal control, the closures of state-owned businesses. According to government statistics, 150 million people lost their jobs in 1993, or the consolations of subsides to poor farmers as they drove Mexico down the fast track towards ratification of NAFTA. The Mexican political and economic elites shared certain unsanguine convictions. They believed that revolution was an anachronism, and that modern Mexico had outgrown the era when peasants and indigenous would rise up against the state to challenge the status quo. They also saw political reforms as unnecessary. Mexicans, it was commonly said, were apathetic, would put up with anything, and would always vote for the PRI. So when the government deregulated coffee prices in 1989 and the price of coffee beans fell by 50% in a single year, the government answer to the economic dislocation in Chiapas was to cut subsidies and disband the only state agencies that provided marketing and technical assistance to small growers. In a single year, the indigenous domestic market share fell from 16% to 3.4%. In 1994, when acquired to institute radical reforms in the agriculture sector in order to qualify for NAFTA and meet the World Bank's terms for a $300 million development loan. President Canales terminated Mexico's traditional system of land tenure and cherished the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. In 1989, the president had declared that the, quote, essential condition for achieving the modernization of rural Chiapas is the direct participation of the peasants as the protagonists of their own reality. Yet, in 1992, he removed existing restrictions on the size of the large estates and abolished the EJODO, the Ajedo law, in order to clear the way for privatization of the land and thus allowing national and foreign agribusiness to grow cash crops for export, violating the inalienability of Ejido lands in Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution of 1917. The discovery that it was the forgotten Mayan village of the Lacundan jungle who had taken up arms shook the president and his cabinet's colleagues to the core. When the president unleashed the Mexican army with orders to, quote, capture the leaders and eliminate the problem, the EZLN strategy of surprise attack followed by rapid withdrawal that melt into the civilian population made a mockery of the army's attempt to encircle and crush them. The original ambition of the rebels to seize the largest military base in the state outside of San Cristobal, supplied themselves with weapons and ammunition, and proceed to the state capital of Tuxtla Gutiérrez, failed. Nevertheless, with only limited ammunition, several thousand poor, armed, undernourished young indigenous men and women launched 8 frontal attacks in as many consecutive days on the base and drove 12,000 heavy armed troops back with tanks, armored cars, rocket firing helicopters, and fighter planes into the defensive. For 10 days, the National Army was reduced to a humiliating spectacle of shelling the hills of Chiapas. After 12 days, the threat of violent upheaval at home and the realization that the image of Chiapas were playing to an international audience, especially to Mexico's new NAFTA partners, had made the price of sustaining the offensive unbearable. Yet the true message of the rebellion had still not reached the government. In the presidential palace, experts demanded that however the true origins of the Zapatistas' National Liberation Army might be, it is not indigenous. To the fury of the Zapatistas' leader, the government's descriptions of the rebel forces changed from a couple of hundred transgressors of the law to a, quote, a professional, violent, and well-trained extremist organizations. Those leaders were Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, or some other variants of the, quote, leftover mercenaries of the exhausted Central American conflict of the 80s. While the rebels, quote, indigenous component, as dismissed as naive, manipulated young cannon fodder for its cynical foreign commandantes. By the time the shooting war stopped, the television cameras and reporters had broadcast far and wide the images and statistics of misery of Mexico's forgotten southeast. The international media, whose glowing report had promoted Salinas' Mexican miracle as the regional blueprint for Latin America, emerging democracies finally began to ask the tough question that cast doubt on the nature of progress of Mexico's development. They awakened a new generation of grassroots activists in Mexican society from, quote, the long and lazy dream of the modernity imposed on everyone and everything. When they did so, quote, they realized, says Jorge Casataneda, that the fundamental national problem so many people thought had been dealt with, inequality, injustice, lack of democracy, had never been resolved at all. Overnight, the quote, local conflict in 4 small municipalities in Chiapas had initiated the national debate of globalization, agrarian policies, indigenous rights, Mexican racism, and democracy. Above all, as primarily mestizo, modern Mexico was forced to confront traditional indigenous Mexico. The debate increasingly focused on the national tormented identification with the 65-year-old ruling political state party system, raising profound questions about its future, stability, and reliability as an economic partner. This country today, said the writer Carlos Montemayor, is a sounding box of political tension. Historically, the rural area have always been the launching pad for political change because of the Mexicans, especially the indigenous, who regard the land as a living entity. In Mexico, we can't play around with the land or pretend that it is a chemically inert property that can change ownership without affecting the deepest fibers of traditional Mexico. Chiapas represents the most urgent warning Mexico has known, a reminder that there exists a traditional population that cannot be ignored as we move into a new century. 5. Conversations in the cathedral. The EZLN came to this dialogue in the true spirit of being heard and explained all the reasons that obliged us to take up arms so as to not die an undignified death. We encountered attentive ears that were willing to hear the truth. The dialogue of San Cristobal was real. There was no trick or lies. There was no buying or selling of dignity. Now that we have a response that reflects the sincere interest of gentlemen commissioned as peace envoys, is our obligation to reflect well on what his words say. We must now speak to the collective hearts that commands us. We must listen to its voice in order to start again. From them, from our people, from the indigenous people in the mountains and canyons, will come the decision on the next step to take along this road. Those destiny will, and the will not be peace with justice and dignity. Juan, a member of the clandestine revolutionary indigenous community, at the conclusion of the dialogue of peace and reconciliation, March 2nd, 1994. It was a Sunday, a lovely sunny day in late February in 1954, when the Zapatistas leader returned to San Cristobal to open peace talks with President Sanales' personal envoy, Manuel Camacho Soles. The town where the war had begun, Camacho Soles, had said the night before, should be the town where the message of peace would first be heard. The Bishop Don Samuel Runts would mediate the talks, and he had opened the doors of the great 16th century Borque Cathedral on San Cristobal de las Casas to provide a safe sanctuary to the participants. The scene was a set piece of political theater. Below the altar steps, against the backdrop of the Mexican flag, as a long baize-covered table, jammed with microphones, as was presided over by the bishop, Peace Commission Camacho, and San Comandante Marcos, the latter wearing his black ski mask with two bandoliers across his chest. Bandoliers, yeah. Masked members of the women and men of the CCRI flanked the three men on either side. In the background, other Zapatista soldiers stood motionless, like medieval statues, lit by shafts of light falling from the great height to pierce the dark, cavernous spaces of the vast cathedral. Facing this scene, standing behind rows upon rows of television cameras, several hundred members of the International Press Corps would attend a daily presentation each evening to learn of the progress of the talks. All week, Marcos dominated the scene. It was from here that he told the Mexicans why the indigenous rebels had come to ask the awkward question, why? He demanded, it is necessary to kill and to die so that you should listen to Ramona, seated here beside me. Tell me that indigenous women want to live, want to study, want hospitals, want medicines, want schools, want food, want respect, want justice, want dignity. The most electrifying moment came on about the third or fourth day of the talks as Marcos turned to the diminutive Ramona, then silently drew from her satchel an immense silk Mexican flag and draped it across his chest, offering one corner of the peace commissioners to assist him holding it up for the cameras. This, he announced, is the flag for which we became soldiers. His speech that day put an end to live radio broadcasts from the cathedral for the rest of the week. But it was too late, for there was Marcos on prime time national television, star, author, and impresario of the script entitled Bringing the Revolution from the Rainforest to the Nation. And there has been nothing comparable in the history of Latin American revolutionary politics. It was in the cathedral that Marcos and the citizens of Mexico's tentative civil society first met. 2 weeks before the talks began, the Zapatistas had written to Mexican non-governmental organizations nationwide, asking them with great respect if they would provide security for the Zapatistas leaders when they came to town. Civil society is not comparable with armed movements, even when the cause is just. It is not the role of civil activists to support violent revolutions. Yet in Mexico in 1994, something new, something manifestly different was in the air. From all over, the students and retired couples came to put their bodies on a peace line by creating a human security cordon around the cathedral 24 hours a day, thus protecting the group of ski mask indigenous leaders who had come to talk about making peace. It was the start of the relationship of trust between the Zapatistas and the Mexican civilians, opposition to the government policies. On January 11th, 1994, while the war between the rebels and the Mexican army was still being fought, the ceasefire could come 24 hours later. The courageous, small, independent daily newspaper in San Cristobal de las Casas, called El Tiempo, published the first Zapatistas communique. Quote, "We are not asking you to agree with us or with the choice we have made," Marcos wrote, "but my companions have asked me to approach you. They hope that since you represent the only honest and objective journalism left in Chiapas, we will give them the opportunity to tell their story." Between January 12th ceasefire and the opening of the first peace talks in the last week of February, Marcos ran an extraordinary press campaign in the selection of national newspapers to introduce the indigenous rebellion to his countrymen. His communiques brought Mexicans a startling new voice. By the time the Zapatistas came to the first peace talks in San Cristobal Cathedral, Marcos had already laid the foundation for the relationship between Mexico's emerging civil society and the indigenous rebellion. The Zapatistas have been taken by surprise by the ceasefire. They had not been expecting the mass mobilization for peace that had forced President Sanales to call off the Mexican army when the rebel forces were retreating, and the end of the 12-day war. Encouraged by the prevailing sense that the PRI was crumbling, the Zapatistas shared with their supporters the irrationally optimistic belief that civil society, that decentralized coalition of many small desperate groups organized around concrete local issues, could be quickly transformed into a coordinated national political movement capable of moving into the open space created by the rebellion. While Manuel Camacho and Bishop Rutz were secluded behind closed doors, negotiating with the collective leadership of the CCRI, Marcos pursued a desperate parallel strategy. Within the Cavaras interior of the cathedral, he lobbied delegations from all over the country, striving to mobilize a mass movement behind the fundamental demands for democracy that Salinas has excluded from the talks. Marcos' message to everyone who trooped to see him was consistent with everything he had been saying since the ceasefire. Quote, "We know our limits. We don't see the armed struggle in the classic sense of all the previous guerrillas. That is, as the one and only way forward, as the only as the only all-powerful truth around which everything else is subordinate. We're not saying here is how we believe the country should be and will shoot anyone who doesn't agree with our views. And we can't solve all the problems of Mexico. What we are saying is, let's make a deal to create a democratic space. And our program wins out in that space, fine. If not, let someone else program win. What matters is that the space must exist. For most of Mexico's progressive middle class, however, it was one thing to support the Zapatistas and quite another to mobilize behind the overt challenge to the legitimacy of the PRI government. Put to the test, the alliance faltered, and when it did, Marcos blamed himself for asking too much. It was too big a thing to expect, he said, as his failure to inspire mass mobilization behind the Zapatistas' demand for some Salinas resignation and the creation of a transition government to dismantle the links between the PRI and the government and open the way for pluralistic democratic elections. When the talks ended, the peace plan the indigenous leaders took back with them to submit to the villagers, including the explicit admission that all previous denials to the contrary, the agrarian laws had indeed never been compiled within Chiapas. The government now promised to investigate the large estate and redistribute the illegally held land, but avoided the two central demands: the return to the original Article 27 legislation and full political autonomy for the indigenous population. Instead, it offered a new Indigenous Bill of Rights, which recognized community practices and customs, and the provision to address the land issue were only applicable within the state of Chiapas. This new Indigenous Bill of Rights worked out with Camacho and the sanctioned by Salinas, I can't say it, was not enough to persuade the rebels to put down their guns. Nevertheless, there was a real sense of progress towards peace and with justice and dignity, but had been made. Relationships of trust had been forged between Camacho and the indigenous leaders. If Camacho is not sincere, then he deserves an Oscar, Marcos told the press. Juan, a spokesman for the CCRI, also spoke warmly of Camacho and especially of the bishop and his team, whom he said had mediated, not in the middle of war and peace, but in the middle of two voices who were trying still to find each other. If some tranquility blossomed in these lands, he continued, it will be due above all to their peacemaking work. 3 weeks later, the villages of the rainforest were in the midst of their consolations on the peace proposals when Luis Donaldo Colosio, President Salinas, hand-picked candidate for the presidential election in August, was assassinated in Tijuana. Overnight, Mexico was a different country. The bullet that killed Colosio also assassinated the political career of Manuel Camacho. There were insinuations of Camacho's involvement in the murder. Colosio, only rival within the PRI. Camacho was also the only national politician with credibility among the Zapatistas and the political courage and will to comfort the risk of a negotiated and sustainable peace in Chiapas. In the rainforest, the I gotta look up this word. I gotta make sure I'm saying it right. It's consultation. Sorry, buddy. Village consultations. 97.88% of the indigenous had voted to reject the government's offer. 2 years later, Marcos told Yves Le Bot, French scholar, and director of Latin American research at the Centro Nacional de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. All this process of dialogue went to hell March 23rd when Colascio was assassinated, and the bullet that killed Colascio killed the possibility of peace accord with the EZLN. We can't sign any pact with someone who isn't even capable of guaranteeing the life of his heir. Why would he guarantee that of his enemy? Also, it reflected the political crisis so deep that we couldn't have reached any result. Once again, President Canales imposed the PRI's replacement candidate, naming a little-known technocrat, Ernesto Zaldillo, by personal fiat. And San Cristobal's dialogue was dead. The hour of the Chiapas counter-revolution had arrived. That's sad. Number 6, the Zaldillo years, 1995 to 2000. The indigenous arrived to give a lesson of modernity. Modernity, to the technocrats plotting the ship of Mexican authoritarianism and put in question the national identity and the legitimacy of the political system. Roger Bartera in La Jornada, June 29th, 1994. In post-Chiapas, Mexico, everything had changed, yet nothing had changed. The Zapatista rebellion had triggered a struggle in the center of the ruling party around the urgent need to reform a system whose internal contradictions were tearing it apart. Colascio was dead, gunned down in the dry heat and dust of Tijuana. But 6 years later, the PRI had not managed to find and punish his assassin. The national security of the PRI was dead too, shot at point blank range, in full daylight in Mexico City, just 6 months after the murder of Colascio. Yet in 1994, nothing could upset the PRI's electoral machine. Not yet. That was coming. But after the August 1994 presidential election, the Mexican left, so energized to unite and united by the Zapatista rebellion, disintegrated once again. Throughout the Zaldillo presidency, political reform within the ruling party was fiercely resisted, and in Chiapas, corrupt local bosses were given a free hand to intensify the militarization and paramilitarization of the indigenous territories. So change, but no change. During the president of Ernesto Zaldillo, the army engaged in low intensity counterinsurgency war in Chiapas. The Mexican army increased its forces from 10,000 to 60,000 men, expanding its military occupation to over half of the state's municipalities. By 2000, the army had 300 camps strategically located around the state and 30 military bases inside the rainforest to repress the rebellious civilian Chiapas population, Zapatista population. At least 9 paramilitary groups trained by the army and police and recruited by the cattlemen and their allies among the loyal good indigenous in the PRI-controlled peasant organization have been operating against the Zapatista communities with complete impunity. When the 1995 President Zaldillo had to decide how he would deal with the growing menace of an ungovernability of civil war in Chiapas, it soon became evident that he was either not willing to or not capable of exerting control over federal government's Zapatista's policies, which has always would remain hostage to other interests. In February 1995, just a few weeks later, after the EZLN had reconfirmed its promises to sustain an indefinite unilateral ceasefire, and while his envoys were holding talks with the Zapatistas leaders about reopening the peace negotiation, President Zeldelio went on national television to reveal the identity of Marcos and some other non-indigenous Zapatistas leader and accused the EZLN of plotting to destabilize the Mexican state and stockpile an arson in the rainforest. He then dispatched the army to seize control of the Zapatistas territory in the rainforest. With warrants for the arrest of the leaders, Zeldelio's army failed to capture Marcos. All they found was his pipe, still smoking and warm. 30,000 troops launched a military offensive into Zapatistas territories, searching for the non-existent armed stockpiles, as well as terrorizing and displacing tens of thousands of civilians. Zeldelio never tried to explain his abrupt about-face, but the entire operation backfired on him as Mexican civil society awoke from its post-electoral lethargy, and 100,000 people marched in Mexico City. Through emails, the Zapatistas were credited as the first revolutionary movement to understand and effectively use the power of the internet. There were immediately solidarity demonstrations in Europe and the United States that revealed the astonishing scope of international support for the Zapatistas. 5 days later, Zeldelio was forced to back down and call off the army, and by April, the government and the Zapatistas had agreed to resume peace talks in the indigenous village of San Andreas Larazara. It took 10 months for the talks to produce an agreement on the first point in the agenda, but on February 16th, 1997, the delegates on both sides signed the next of a remarkable new accord on the indigenous rights and culture that recognized the indigenous in the Mexican Constitution and committed the state to constructing a new judicial framework guaranteeing political, jurisdictional had always included official recognition of self-government in all indigenous territories, villages, and municipalities nationwide. At the level of state, Zapatistas' vision of decentralized autonomous political authority had been articulated nearly 80 years ago by their hero, Emiliano Zapata. Municipal liberty, wrote Zapata. This is the first and most important democratic institution, since nothing is more natural or worthy of respect than the right that the citizens of any settlement have of arranging by themselves the affairs of their common life and of resolving as best suits them the interests and needs of their locality. In January 1996, 5 weeks before finalizing an agreement with the government in San Andreas on legislation intended to radically reform relationships between the state of Mexico and indigenous populations, the Zapatistas sponsored a special forum on indigenous rights and culture in San Cristobal de las Casas, at which over 500 representatives from 35 indigenous groups reached a consensus on the demands that they wanted to see, including within the terms of any new accord arrived at in the negotiations. For the Zapatistas, their ability to deliver the government's commitment to meet these demands within the terms of the document that, as spelled out in the language of the concluding sections, committed the Mexican government to build, quote, a new social pact that reform at the roots and exists social, political, economic, and cultural relations with indigenous peoples, signified a huge step forward. Effectively, the San Andreas Accords of Indigenous Rights and Culture represents a historical breakthrough for Mexico's indigenous, with its promise for recognition and promotion of a multicultural nature of the nation. Its acceptance of the principle that, quote, the development of the nation must be based on plurality, understood as peaceful, productively, respectfully, and equitably living together in diversity. But once again, President Zedelio, you did a U-turn and refused to sign the accord. Months later, when he disavowed the legal draft prepared by members of the Official Commission of Accordance and Peace, COPA, for presentations to Congress, even after the next have been amended to deal with his objection and the changes accepted by the Zapatistas negotiators on September 1996. The Zapatistas withdrew from the peace negotiations. By then, as the army continued to tighten the circle around the EZLN and the repression of dirty war of the paramilitaries intensified, life inside the rainforest under any army of occupation had become so violent that the men no longer dared leaving their communities to work their crops. The hunger now stalked the rainforest, while in northern Chiapas, an increasingly polarized and tense situation stoked by an open alliance of police and paramilitaries had created a situation of ungovernability. As the rebellion entered its third year, the number of those who had been killed or wounded in the undeclared low-intensity war exceeded the number who died during the 12-day war. Despairingly, the bishop warned that the PRI paramilitaries operating against opposition, Partito Revocula, I can't say it, the PRD, members of the Zapatistas, with the blatant complicity of the police and the army, were fomented in fratricidal war. But the president had long since decided to back the local extremists who had demanded the bishop's head, and the federal government permitted the criminal situation to fester. Northern Chiapas was a tinderbox. In December 1997, it exploded. The Christmas week massacre of 45 unprotected refugees in the little village of Actel was a tragedy foretold. 2 weeks prior to the massacre, a delegation from Mexico City had visited the area where the killings were taking place. The catalyst for this visit was the Mexican television report that had documented killings of pro-government paramilitaries in the region. The camera had documented a plight of thousands of displaced families driven from their village by the violence during the preceding months and weeks, and living in makeshift camps without food, medicine, access to clean drinking water, or adequate shelter from the bitter rains and freezing fogs of the December nights. Chiapas witnessed a atrocity, had also exposed the fact that while rampant impunity protecting the paramilitaries, even flight offered no guarantees to safety to the refugees. Isolated and surrounded by the same paramilitary troops who had driven them from their homes, burned their houses, stole their animals and all their possessions, and were now harvesting their coffee crops, their sole source of income for the year ahead. The refugees lived in terror of further attacks. The broadcast aired nationally in prime time on Sunday evening, December 7th, 1997. The delegations came to Chiapas to see the conditions of the refugee camps for themselves for 4 days later, accompanied by the press. In the days immediately preceding the December 22nd massacre, there were many disturbing reports. One report described the delegates' visit to the village of Pachiqual, very close to Actal, where paramilitaries had kidnapped 20 families and had been holding them hostage. They have not permitted to talk to us or to move about, the report explained. Patrolling the area are men with various official uniforms, from those of Army, the Judicial Police, a federal police force, to men in brown and black with red bandanas, in imitating the uniform of the Zapatistas National Liberation Army. The observers had to leave the area quickly. The report continue. Facing with hostilities of the village authorities, the 20 families, some incomplete because other members have been able to flee, could be dead right now. They are at the mercy of gunmen. But it was not the hostage of Pechuquel who died. It was those members of their families who had managed to escape and had subsequently been given refuge by the community of nearby Actel. When the pro-government killers struck most of the women and small children they attacked and murdered, had already been driven from their homes and had seen their families shattered in the process. But although they knew that they were prime targets of a paramilitary strategy to cleanse the area of Zapatista sympathizers and ought to have left the area for their own safety, the women refused to move away from their men, trapped in Pechuquel. We are Las Abajas, the bees. The refugees had told journalists 2 weeks earlier, we have organized as a civil society with the help of the church. You are not EZLN. We do not want guns. We have to conduct our fight for our rights peacefully. That is why we painted our houses and our churches white and put up signs which say neutral zone. But, they explained, we are also civilian supporters of Zapatistas. We look and we see that like them, we are following the same path for a better Mexico, a Mexico with justice for all the people. 2 weeks before the tragedy, the people in Actel defined their roles in relations to the Zapatistas' rebellion struggles for indigenous rights. We are the cushion between the government and the Zapatistas, they said. If you are going to be an attack against them, we as civil society are the ones who can resist. But if this cushion tears, then it is easier for the government to attack our brothers in the Zapatistas army. On December 22nd, 1997, the protective cushion of Las Abajas was torn to shreds when a uniformed paramilitary force armed with AK-47s, R-15 assault rifles loaded with army-issued ammunition, soft nose or expanding bullets, went on a obscene 4-hour killing spree in Actel. Within days of the attack, the Mexican army was advancing deep into Zapatista's rainforest territory, south and east of Actel. Spokesman for the Mexican Minister of Defense said the military were searching for Zapatista weapons. Soldiers in the rainforest told indigenous villagers they had orders from the president to find and arrest the EZLN leaders. Twice before, in January 1994, when the rebel army was retreating to the rainforest, and again in February 1995, when President Zedillo ordered the army to arrest the entire Zapatista leadership, who had assembled to study the government's last proposal for restarting the peace talks. Mass mobilization of Mexican and international Zapatista supporters had forced the government to back away from the military solution. This time, the president intensified the military pressure. And then, suddenly, the magical Zapatista's ability to inspire the solidarity and affections of a largely apolitical and anti-ideological generation on the global scale kicked in. In Mexico City, several 100,000 people marched. Thousands of artists, academics, writers, and entertainers signed pledges of support. There were dozens of concerts and aid convoys all across Mexico. The volunteers packed and shipped hundreds of tons of supplies for the Chiapas refugees. 1,200 Roman Catholic catechists from the San Cristobal diocese made a pilgrimage across the country to build support for the bishop's blueprint for peace. 1,101 Mexico City women, symbolizing the number of rebellious Zapatista self-governed communities that had organized in accordance with the San Andreas Accord, drove to Chiapas to support Zapatistas, women and children who were resisting the army's incursion, armed with sticks and stones. Dozens of human rights organizations traveled to Chiapas from all over the country and participated in one of the church-sponsored peace camps established by bishops' dioceses to monitor the military presence in 26 Zapatista villages, and had remained partially invulnerable after the Army 1995 offensive. Abroad, meanwhile, in 130 cities in 27 countries of five continents, Zapatista supporters marched in the cities across Europe, Latin America, and United States, Australia, and Africa. In Italy, 60,000 Italians took the streets in 9 cities. The same outpour took place in Spain, Catalonia, and the Basque country, country, while Mexican consulates in Hamburg, San Francisco, Quanto, Venice, and Ancona were among the long list of Mexican government and travel offices abroad occupied by Zapatista sympathizers. Resolution of the support for the Zapatistas and calls on the Mexican government to withdraw the army from Chiapas and restart the peace talks poured in from organizations and individuals in diverse and Spanish judges for democracy and Fiat Motor worker unions and the Pope, the Swiss Parliament, the French unions, and the Parliament of European Union. On January 27th, the Italian Parliament Foreign Affairs Commission suspended the Mexican-European Union trade agreements in mid-February. A delegation of 170 European politicians, intellectuals, and human rights observers traveled to Chiapas on the fact-finding mission, and once again the military solution was averted. Number 7. Zapatismo is not an ideology. It is not a bought and paid for doctrine. It is an institution, something so open and flexible that it really occurs in all places. Zapatismo poses the question: what is it that has excluded me? What is it that has isolated me? In each place, the response is different. Zapatimismo simply states the question and stipulates that the response is plural, that the response is inclusive. Marcos. All right, here we go. 6 years ago, when the rebellion was still young, a graffiti went up in San Cristobal de las Casas. We are not guerrillas, we are revolutionaries. At the time, the distinction was unclear to many people. In hindsight, the statement said everything Mexicans need to learn about the Zapatistas. In those early days, the people who came to Chiapas to meet and find out about the Zapatistas were Mexican citizens from the white mestizos, urban progressive minority who wanted to democratize Mexico, antiquated, corrupt political systems, but wanted change to come nonviolently. In those earliest contacts between the indigenous rebels from Mexico, forgotten past, and the non-indigenous citizens of modern Mexico, each brought something to the dialogue the other needed. His citizens brought the unlimited power of access to the world beyond the poverty-stricken ghetto of the rainforest. The revolutionaries from the excluded Mesoamerican country brought the agenda: democracy, justice, liberty, pluralism, and indigenous rights. To discover the moment when the Zapatistas National Liberation Army began the process of transformation from a military vanguard of the armed indigenous and the peasant socialist revolution to an open-ended revolutionary democratic civilian phenomenon that defies and challenges conventional political analysis. One need to go back to the first encounter in February 1994 between the Zapatista leaders and the Mexican activists who came to San Cristobal to create a human society cordon around the cathedral during the San Cristobal talks. When they formed that absurd and marvelous cordon of peace, Marcos told Yavan Labat 2 years later, it took us completely by surprise. They were hungry, taking risk, getting photographed by the army. They could lose their jobs. All that just because they believed in it. It was our first contact with them. I wouldn't call it Zapatismo yet. It's a movement barely emerging. People of all classes, from high to low, who sympathize with certain ideas of Zapatismo and who come to see, who want to meet us, get to know us. From such beginnings through the series of meeting with Mexican and international civil society in the rainforest, through the National Convention for Democracy in August 1994, in which the Zapatistas inaugurated the first of 5 civil society encounter forums and resistance centers named Aguascalientes in honor of the village of Zapata and Francisco Villa, meet in 1917 to write the revolutionary agrarian laws. Through the convictions of the movement of national liberation, the first and second El Centros for the humanity and against neoliberalism, and the formation of the Zapatistas Front for National Liberation, or the FZLN, Zapatismos, who has remained faithful to the EZLN's original vision to give the political landscape not just another political organization, but something really truly new. Zapatismo is not a party nor a guerrilla force. It is a catalyst, an instigator, a creator of possibilities. It provides a platform for the widest possible convergence of democratic forces, multi-ethnic, multi-party, multicultural, ageless, classless, and all contributing to the vast incontinent movement that would return power to society. Zapatismo seeks a transformation of the future through radicalization of democracy. The graffiti that said, "We are not guerrillas, we are revolutionaries," use old words in new ways. It said to the Mexicans that the revolution to which the Zapatista movement inspires is a radical democratic dialogue, not a violent rebellion. This is what makes the Zapatistas so threatening to their enemies and so challenging and attractive to their supporters. The only thing that we proposed to do was to change the world. All right. Let's see. Okay, I think... Hold on a second. Let me see how long this timeline goes. Timeline goes to 49. Where we at? Check out this timeline. Okay, I can do the timeline. We'll do the timeline and then we'll be done. Zapatista's timeline. It's going to be just the list. I'm going to read the list. Tom Henson and the Enlace Civil. Beginning of history. Mayan settled area now known as Chiapas, Mexico. 1524 to 27, Spaniards conquered Mayan people, being 5 centuries of exploitation and repression. In late 1500s, Mayan population reduced by 50% through disease and repression. Population doesn't begin to recover until mid 17th century. 1712, indigenous Zetala rebellion brought on by Spanish on tribute demands and court failures. The Zetelas were brutally upheld. 1824, Chiapas separates from Guatemala to join a weak Mexican state, allowing relative autonomy autonomy for local elites, and beginning decades of liberal conservative struggles for control over the land and indigenous labor. Both liberals and conservatives accrue huge land holdings, displacing indigenous owners, and many indigenous people are forced into virtual slavery. 1867 to 70, indigenous communities rebel over taxation, control of markets, and religious freedom in Chamula. Violent repression again defeats the rebellion. 1876 to 1910, dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz oversees accumulation of immense land holdings by local mestizos. Chiapas economy is open to international trade, with coffee, coca, and mahogany as major exports. 1910 to 1920, Mexican Revolution. In Chiapas, the fight is over control of land and indigenous labor when General Alvaro Obregón becomes president in 1920. Regional Cacuys declare loyalty in exchange for autonomy to govern Chiapas. Mexico's ensuing agrarian reforms has limited the impact in the state. 1929, Kelles creates a National Revolutionary Party, PNR, the precursor for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, in power for 71 years until its defeat in July 2000 elections. July 2nd, 2000 elections. 1934 to 1940, the populist presidency of Lorenzo Cárdenas proclaims a common struggle with indigenous communities. Many indigenous Chapanecos assume position in PRI control, labor unions, and peasant organizations. Although the Cárdenas populism largely ends with his presidency, many indigenous political structures remain under PRI control for decades. 1940 to 70, land reform. Under the EJIDO system, communally owned land continues to lag in Chiapas, while large landowners consolidate their holdings. Cattle ranching becomes an important business as roads penetrate the state. Pressure for land from the booming indigenous population results in over 100,000 indigenous migrating to the Lacandon jungle. 1960, Samuel Rutz Garcia is named bishop in San Cristobal de la Casa after the Medellin Council of Latin American Bishops. In 1968, Rutz begins to promote liberation theology and an indigenous-centered Catholicism. 1968, students' movement in Mexico City is brutally repressed, with hundreds murders by the government agents of the Tlatelolco massacre. The repression convinces many activists to carry their struggles underground. Over the next decade, more than 24 urban guerrilla groups developed throughout Mexico. The most active period of guerrilla activity is between 1971 to 1975. Most movements disintegrated under brutal repression and a dirty war, which leaves hundreds of activists disappeared and over 100,000 dead. 1970s, pressure for land participates coordinating committees. Plan del Alali, 24 peasants organization declares themselves independent of the government. 1982, General Abba Saloon Castellanos Dominguez, becomes governor of Chiapas and oversees a dramatic increase of militarization to control land struggles. During his administration, 102 campesinos are assassinated, 327 are disappeared, 590 are imprisoned, 420 are kidnapped and tortured, 104 families were expelled from their homes, and 54 communities are overrun by security forces. 1983, Marcos and the other activists from the National Liberation Force, FLN, arrive in Chiapas. The Zapatistas National Liberation Army is born on November 17th, with their 3 indigenous and 3 mestizos. 1985 earthquake destroying large sections of Mexico City. Inadequate and corrupt response by government official forces civil society to organize itself, marking an important break in PRI control. 1986, EZLN enters first indigenous community at invitation of local leaders. 1988, fraudulent presidential elections on July 6, bringing PRI candidate Carlos Canales del Gorta to power. Opposition candidate, oh my gosh, I can't say this, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas is ahead in polling when vote counting computers suddenly crash. 3 days later, Canales is declared the winner. 1989, EZLN grows to over 1,300 armed members. 1992, President Canales reforms Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, ending 75 years of land reform and allowing the privatization of IDOS. 1993, Zapatista communities approve a military offensive by the EZLN and form the Clandestine Indigenous Revolutionary Committee General Command, CCRI-CG, to lead the struggle. 1994, January, NAFTA is implemented on January 1st. On the same day, 3,000 members of the EZLN occupied 6 large towns and hundreds of ranches in the armed uprising. Within 24 hours, the army responds, bombing indigenous communities and killing at least 145 indigenous people. Mexican civil service responds with massive demonstration calling for the end to military repression. A ceasefire is declared on January 12th. February, peace talks begin, but the government peace proposal is rejected by the Zapatista community. August, the Zapatistas organize a national democratic convention. Over 6,000 people representing a broad range of civil society gather in Aguascalientes, I can't say the word, in a meeting place carved out of the jungle. Ernesto Zedillo is elected president, and Eduardo Robolandan Rancan is elected governor amid widespread charges of fraud. Armando Alvendano Faguangro, the PRD candidate, declares a, quote, government in rebellion. On December 19th, the Zapatistas declared the civil authority of 38 autonomous indigenous municipalities, representing a serious challenge to local PRI power structure. In Mexico, the Mexican peso tumbles, losing more than half of its value during the next 2 months. A U.S./International Monetary Fund bailout of $50 billion does not mitigate dramatic increases in unemployment and loss of living standards during the following years. The majority of Mexican sufferers, while the elite enjoys the fruit of privatization and NAFTA. 1995, January, the Chase Manhattan Bank issues a report calling for the Mexican government to, quote, eliminate the Zapatistas. At this point, dozens of communities have publicly defined themselves as Zapatistas, representing over 50,000 civilians. On February 9th, the army mounts a massive invasion in Zapatista areas and of influence, implementing a strategy of low-intensity warfare, also known as civil 1,000 campesinos, destroying Agua Scalantes, can't say the word, and turns it into an army base. The Zapatistas respond by constructing 5 new Agua Scalantes centers of indigenous resistance. During the next 5 years, over 60,000 armed troops occupy nearly every corner of the state, establishing armed encampments just yards from most of the well-established Zapatista community, disrupting the lives and economy and culture of indigenous communities. April, peace talks resume. August, the Zapatistas hold the first international consulate, I can't say it. Over a million people vote, calling the EZLN to transform itself into a new independent political force. October, talks begin in San Andreas, La Razara, on indigenous rights and culture. 1996, February, the EZLN and the government, almost done, and the government signed the San Andreas Accord, outlining the program of land reform, indigenous autonomy, culture rights. March, talks began on democracy and justice, including with no agreement on August 12th, as government representatives refused to discuss Zapatista's proposal and present nothing substantial for their own. August/July, the Zapatistas organized the first intercontinental encuentro for humanity and against neoliberalism. Several thousand people attend from Mexico and around the world to discuss the role of civil society and in confronting neoliberalism. On August 30th, the EZLN suspend peace talks, demanding that the government representatives actually be empowered to negotiate. December, President Zedillo formally rejects the San Andreas Accords. 1997, July. The July 6 midterm elections marked significant gains for opposition parties inside the conflict zone. In Chiapas, however, abstention reaches 90%. Chiapas elections are notoriously fraudulent, and the high rate of abstentions reflects a general mistrust of government and in the indigenous communities. On September 12th, they abstained from it. The Zapatistas arrived in Mexico City for the founding of the Unarmed Zapatistas National Liberation Front, FZLN, the civil political arm of the indigenous movement. On December 22nd, a paramilitary group affiliated with the PRI attacks a church in a community of Octel, killing 45 indigenous campesinos, mostly women and children. Paramilitary activity has been growing throughout the state for several years as part of the strategy of civilian targeted warfare. Local PRI officials and armed officers are implicated, but the intellectual authors are never brought to justice. Shortly after, the Zedillo administration denies the existence of paramilitaries in Chiapas, and the army begins a campaign to disarm the EZLN, but not the paramilitary groups. 1998, February. In a twisted response to the Actel massacre, February marks the beginning of a campaign to expel foreign human rights observers from Chiapas, as the Zedillo administration tries to hide the truth from the world. Over 150 were expelled during the coming 2 years. Peace talks were still suspended, and the government continues to increase military presence throughout the state. April, the army begins to dismantle autonomous Zapatista communities. Over 1,000 troops and police invade 4 communities, destroying records and arresting community leaders. June, the army campaign is dismantled. Rebel communities culminates in the pre-dawn invasion of San Juan del Libertad in June. At least 8 civilians and 1 policeman are killed. The resulting outcry from civil society puts a temporary halt to the army's offensive. Bishop Samuel Rutz ends his efforts to mandate a peace, accusing the government of preferring the path of war and repression. 1999, March, the Zapatistas organized and Consulta on indigenous rights and culture. Over 5,000 civilian Zapatista conduct a week-long program of popular education throughout the country. On March 20th, over 3 million Mexican vote. 1,000 of polling places agree that San Andreas Accords should be implemented. April, state police occupied autonomous community of San Andreas, Sagachman site of an historic San Andreas Accords and installs a PRI mayor. And following day, 3,000 unarmed Zapatistas non-violently forced the police to leave the town and reinstall their election representative. May, the second national encuentro of civil society draws 2,000 participants to discuss the March Consulta. August, the military deploys paratroopers and forces to occupy the remote village of Amador Hernandez, the final link in plans to build a road that will encircle the Zapatistas in the Lacandan jungle. The community resists with nonviolent protests, but the military encampment remains. 2,000 Zapatista communities registered to vote in historic numbers of the National Election Commission announced at least 100 new polling places in these communities. July, Vincent Fox, a conservative PAN party, is elected president, rupturing 71 years of PRI control. That's the end. The book. Making sure. Yep, that's the end. All right, end of the book. All right. D-Bro, welcome to come up.
Hello.
Hello, what's up? What would you like to say?
I found it interesting at the end of the book how they said that they were not a guerrilla group, but revolutionaries.
Yeah.
But, I'm wondering if that means that they, are they just sticking to rhetorical violence? Is that
I don't know.
Because that's what it feels like.
Well, our response.
I could be wrong.
Our response is in the defense. We don't usually in a revolution. We respond to them doing something to us, right? So I don't know. I think they're armed and they still fight off the Mexican government and the Mexican paramilitary troops. So they have to resist through armed struggle. They have to. They have no choice.
Yeah.
If you read all the rest of it, they have no choice but armed struggle.
Yeah, I get that. That's why I was just a little confused at the end.
Yeah. Because a lot of groups are starting to arm for defense. That's the goal, is to arm the proletariat for defense. You know? What's up? Do you have anything else before I go to Joe?
No.
Joe?
I'm going to read what Rocket Surgeon said. From what they understand, the PRI was the power grab liberals after the revolution and suppressed opposition.
Exactly. Those are the land-owning people that actually took from the indigenous, and the mestizos are also part of the thing. They can collaborate with the mestizos and the indigenous people, because the mestizos, I think, can vacillate sometimes. But most of the time, they're on the side of the indigenous resistance. You know what I mean? So.
Okay, and then Linda and I both would like to be reminded. What's the next book that we're going to be reading again?
Let me go get it.
Hey, people over Profit. If you'd like to know, we will be starting a new book tomorrow evening at 6:30 Central. Yeah, Rocket Surgeon, the timeline at the end. That was definitely a very good thing. Yep, you can reread it, and It's a great read. It's just a great read. You'll love it. It's entertaining. It's fun. It's educational. I love this book. Marcos is an amazing writer.
All right.
Yeah.
So this is the book. Let me get it up. If I can do it. If it lets me. Uh-huh. So this is what we're reading next.
Sure, Rocket, go ahead and... Do you want to come up, Rocket? Or do you want to keep typing? Because I'll make sure that we pay attention to the comments, but like...
That's the next book we're reading. I think it's a book to go through and to understand because it is a textbook. So if people are going to... Oh, wait.
Next?
Huh?
Are we doing part 2 after this one?
Yes. We'll be doing this one and then historical materialism. So, and this is a Vietnamese book. So this is Ho Chi Minh thought. And the person that translated is Vietnamese. People know who Luna Nguyen.
Luna Hoi.
Nguyen. Or I think it's... If I remember correctly. Hold on. Scott, how do you pronounce Nguyen?
Nguyen. Luna Nguyen.
Yeah, the South Korean last name. It's Nguyen. I'm right. It's pronounced Nguyen.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to do this book next. And then they just barely translated the second part to it, which is historical materialism. This book will go over different types of meanings like quantitative, qualitative, to the comparing. It will also go through dialectical materialism, materialist dialectics. We'll also go through many different things. So it's going to have lots of pictures and a lot of things because it is a textbook. So if people are going to read along, have it open so you can look at the pictures that I'm looking at. I'll do my best to try to show them as best as I can. You know what I mean? But yeah.
Also, sorry.
Glenn just did an @everyone tag to tag the book you're going to read next so that everyone can go grab the book.
Okay. And I know it's a Marxist-Leninist book, but it's still worth reading. It still has the correct information in it. You know what I mean? It's all that matters.
Yeah.
It has the correct information in it. What's up?
I said, yeah, it has the soil. And also, for those of you that are interested in like the writer, they do have a YouTube channel called Luna Hoi.
Mm-hmm. Yes, every day, 6:30 at the same time, 7:30 Eastern time, 6:30 Central time. So it's about a 300-page book. I haven't looked at. I've read this like twice, maybe 3 times. So going through it again, it's going to be fucking amazing because I'm more developed than I was when last time I read it. But I've never read the second part. I've been waiting for what? How many? Like years, right?
Yeah, it's been over a year.
It's been way over a year trying to get that second part, which is, again, it's going to go over what historical materialism is. Now, if you all want to, there's a book that Stalin came out with called, I think, is it called Dialectical Materialism, Historical Materialism, or is it Dialectics and Historical Materialism? Very brief book of what historical materialism is. If you guys want to go over and briefly do that before we go on this. But this should take us a couple weeks to do. You know, we should probably take our time through it, you know?
Yeah. That sounds great.
This will help with your Leninism a bit, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, does anybody else have anything else to say before I close it out?
Much love and take care.
Thank you.
If I might have a lot of questions. If I have a lot of questions, am I allowed to request up or?
Of course.
Awesome.
Yeah. Also, write down questions too, and write down the page number. So if you have a question and you think it could wait till the end, that too. But if you have a question, it's very important. Yes. I think we should go through this so that people can understand it. as best we can get them to understand it. You know what I mean?
Yes, perfect. I can highlight and bookmark. So if I have questions, I'll try to highlight and bookmark. But as long as we stop often, because there's going to be a lot.
Even during the reading, if we could stop too, if you can, like, I might. So if you hear me sigh, it's only because like I it's just who I am. It's like, okay, fine. You know what I mean? So you're reading these books too? Yay, that's cool. I've been waiting for the second part for fucking over a year now, and I'm hoping it's out. So I'm going to read both of them online. What were you going to say, Joe?
I was going to say awesome, and I was going to tell Lee that we are starting these books tomorrow here, where we'll be reading them aloud if you want to read along. I was going to say, communists, pay attention, see the comment.
Oh, could you read the page number? Yeah, I said I will. I'll give you the page numbers and everything. No worries and stuff. So
Cool, Lee. We do readings at 6:30 Central every day. If we miss a day, we're really sorry, but we do try for every day.
yeah, I like doing it because I do my personal reading and I do this reading. So my personal reading's a little zero-centric because I'm not only reading Lenin and his selected works, but I'm also a part of a group that's actually, I'm part of an educational corner, so they have a task for me to do. So now I'm going to go and read that. So I do a little Eurocentric stuff, a little bit, but it's foundation for Leninism and stuff like that. But I read all of like anti-colonial, decolonial stuff on this out loud here. Because we're going to get, after we're done with these two books, we're going to go into the Black Radical Tradition. I'm going to read Tip of the Spear, and I plan to read Black Reconstruction. And from there, I don't know where I'm going to take it after that. But those are the two books I plan to read when I'm going into the Black Radical Tradition. Because as a Maoist, we are told to seek and to understand the Black Radical Tradition, to learn from the Black Radical Tradition, and also learn from indigenous resistance. So I go back and forth on this between Black Radical Tradition as best I can and an indigenous thought. So yeah. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and close it all out. I appreciate you all. Unless anybody has anything to say, I'll give it about 5.